2 weeks after her husband Angus Veitch had taken a horse's hoof to the temple, a good horse too, one they'd shod themselves not 6 months prior, a mare with a white blaze down her face that had been docile enough until something spooked her in the corral. The town councilman came into the smithy while Hannah was hammering out a horseshoe, the ring of iron on iron, loud enough that she did not hear them enter, until she saw the shadow of 3 men falling across the anvil's face, and she lowered her hammer and turned to face them. Her breath still coming hard from the work, her fingers already knowing the weight of the tool so completely that it felt less like something she carried than something she had become, as though her hands had grown into it over the years like a tree growing around a branch. And when she set it down, the muscles in her arm continued to quiver with the familiar echo of impact. The older of the 3 councilmen, a merchant named Thurston, with a face like cured leather and eyes that would not meet hers directly, his whiskers stained yellow from chewing tobacco, cleared his throat with the delicate precision of a man preparing a formal pronouncement, and said that the lease on the smithy had been her husband's personal arrangement with the town, made many years prior when he first arrived, with nothing but his tools and his skill, and that the arrangement could not continue on for a widow, as there were certain proprieties to maintain and certain questions of liability when it came to a woman operating such a dangerous trade, and in particular when there were young children in the household, small boys who ought to be in school rather than playing among hammers and hot iron. The older of the 3 councilmen, a merchant named Thurston with a face like cured leather and eyes that would not meet hers directly, cleared his throat and said that the lease on the smithy had been her husband's personal arrangement with the town, and that the arrangement could not continue on for a widow, as there were certain proprieties to maintain and certain questions of liability when it came to a woman operating such a dangerous trade, and in particular when there were young children in the household. The other 2 men said nothing, but stood with their hands clasped before them like schoolboys, their eyes fixed on the anvil or the tools, anywhere but on her face. And Hannah set both her palms flat on the workbench where the light from the window fell across them, and she asked if her work was deficient, if there had been complaints from any ranchers, and Thurston said no. The work was acceptable, only that it was the principle of the matter, that a woman's station was in the home and not the smithy, and that they had been generous in allowing her 2 weeks to order her affairs, but the new lease would go to Jasper Oakes, a man from over Powder River way who had apprenticed with a proper blacksmith back in Pennsylvania. Hannah nodded very slowly and did not speak, the muscles of her jaw tight, and the men eventually withdrew with what looked like relief, their boots loud on the packed dirt floor, echoing off the stone hearth. And when they had gone, she stood alone in the smithy, with the fire dying in the forge, and the afternoon light coming gold and thick through the high window, and falling across the tools her late husband had collected over 23 years of marriage and labor, each one worn smooth by his hands and now by hers. And she knew in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost like rage, that she would not ask for extensions or favors or any manner of intercession from anyone in Coldgate, that she would not grovel before Thurston or the other councilmen, that she would not seek their pity or their charity or their permission to continue her work, and she knew equally that she would not be working any more for Jasper Oakes or any other man who might come after him, apprenticed or otherwise, that there was no place for her in this town as a woman alone, as a widow with her hands calloused from work, as someone who understood the heat and the weight and the ring of metal on metal better than most men ever would. She stood for a long time in the cooling smithy and listened to the sound of the wind in the eaves above her and felt the weight of the tools around her, the tongs hanging on their hooks, the files arranged by size and purpose, the hammers of different weights all positioned for a hand that knew how to use them. And she began to understand that these tools had never truly belonged to Angus, that they belonged to the craft itself, and that if she was not permitted to practice the craft in Coldgate, then she would practice it elsewhere, and she would take these tools with her into whatever darkness awaited. That Sunday, she dressed herself and the boys in their good clothes and walked with them to the church, a white clapboard structure on the edge of town, and sat with them in the back pew as she always did. And Reverend Eustace Thorncroft preached about the natural order of things as ordained by Scripture, speaking with a thin voice about how the woman should keep silence and answer all questions to her husband, and how her glory was her long hair and submission and meek spirit. And though he did not point directly at Hannah where she sat with her chestnut braid visible down her back, she felt the weight of his words pressing down like stones, understood that they had been measured out specifically for her benefit, that the sermon had been constructed as a civic pronouncement against her presumption. His wife Cordelia sat in the front pew in a bonnet of black silk, with a rigid set to her shoulders and her hands folded tightly in her lap. And when the sermon concluded and the congregation rose to sing, Cordelia did not rise, but remained seated with her body very still, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the wall as though she were carved from stone. And Hannah understood this calculated discourtesy as a statement, a public declaration of judgment and disapproval, and she felt the chill of it as surely as if Cordelia had spoken aloud. The general store owner's wife, who kept the ledgers and managed the accounts and controlled what was bought and sold in the community, looked at Hannah with an expression of mingled contempt and satisfaction. And the town butcher, a broad-shouldered man named Crick, with ham-like fists and a permanent smell of blood and salt on his apron, did not turn his head at all, but kept his gaze forward with exaggerated rigidity, as though Hannah and her boys were not present in the building at all, as though they had been rendered invisible by the force of civic disapproval. During the week that followed her departure from the smithy, Hannah went about closing the accounts with methodical precision and a kind of grim finality, paying what she owed to the suppliers and collecting what was due from those who had commissioned work, which amounted to $4.18, that she wrapped carefully in a cloth and placed in the stone crock where they kept their savings, a sum that would buy perhaps 2 weeks of flour and salt. And then she began the real work of preparing her husband's tools for transport, oiling each one with a cloth and careful attention, running her fingers across the familiar surfaces and wrapping them in canvas and burlap, with the respect due to tools that had earned the respect of their users. And she hauled out his great anvil from its position on the heavy oak block, where it had sat for 23 years like some monument to labor and craft, and its weight was immense and absolute. and she knew in her bones that moving it would require more than one pair of hands and more than one attempt. So she went to the stables, where there was a man named Hollister who hired out with teams and sled animals, and asked about renting a sled large enough to carry the anvil and the other tools. And Hollister, seeing that she had no money for such services, though she would have such metal work as might pay for it later when she was established somewhere else, agreed to provide the sled in exchange for 3 sets of horseshoes fitted to very particular dimensions that he specified, dimensions suited to a particular horse he owned that had an unusual gait, and she completed that work in 2 days and 2 nights, barely sleeping, her hands moving with the certainty of long practice. And by the evening of the 2nd day, the sled sat outside the smithy in the gathering cold, and it was loaded with her husband's anvil and hammer, bellows, tongs, chisels, files, and rasps. And she had wrapped her own few precious tools, the hammer her father had given her before he died, the tongs she had forged when she was learning, in canvas, and tied them to the sled's frame with cord, and she had packed into a wooden crate what flour and salt and coffee remained from their stores. And the following morning, in light snow that came down soft and steady like ash from some distant fire, she dressed herself carefully in her heavy charcoal wool cloak and pulled the hood up so that her chestnut braid hung down the back of it, visible as a rope of dark hair against the gray wool, and she helped her sons up onto the sled among the tools, positioning them carefully so they would not fall, and she gave them each a blanket to wrap around themselves, though it was not yet terribly cold, for she knew that the temperature would drop as they climbed, and she took hold of the sled's rope with both hands and began to pull, her shoulders settling into the work as she had settled into work all her life. The boys were 6 years old and had not yet fully understood the permanence of what was happening, though they had felt its weight pressing down on the house like a physical force in those weeks after their father's death, felt it in the way their mother's movements had become economical and careful, felt it in the long silences at night when she did not sing, and now they sat among the tools with small grins on their faces that seemed to Hannah both heartbreaking and wonderful, delighting in the motion of the sled as it moved over the frozen ground, in the snow that fell soft against their faces, in what seemed to them an adventure into a vast whitened world that held promise rather than danger. And Hannah did not correct this impression, but let them have it, let them believe in the adventure. And she pulled steadily, with her hands gripping the rope and her body leaning forward into the work, and she did not look back at the town as it receded behind them, did not allow herself the indulgence of looking back, for she knew that if she turned and saw the buildings and the people and the life she was leaving, she might falter, and she could not afford to falter. She had known about the ice cave from her husband, who had hunted elk and mule deer in the foothills of Thunder Ridge for most of the years they had been together, moving through that country with a hunter's patience and a knowledge of the land that had come to him, not from any formal education, but from long acquaintance. And he had once spent a night there during a sudden storm that had caught him unprepared in the high country, and he had come home with stories of it that he had shared with her on nights when the fire was burning low and the boys were sleeping. A great vault of blue-white ice carved by glaciers in some distant age before men came to this country, with walls smooth as glass and polished by the movement of ancient ice, and a floor that sloped downward into chambers beyond, chambers that descended into a darkness he had not dared to explore. And he had spoken of feeling warmth rising from deep within the stone, a palpable warmth that came from the earth's depths and seemed impossible in so cold a place where the ice had been solid and unchanging for longer than any man's lifetime. And he had drawn for her a crude map on brown paper, showing the approach from the north through a draw of pine and aspen, marking the high places and the watercourses and the landmarks a traveler might use to find the way. And she had kept that map folded in the tin where she kept her buttons and thread and needles, and she had taken it out sometimes and studied it by candlelight, and she had thought of that warm stone beneath the ice and wondered if such a place could shelter a person, if such a place could become a refuge. The journey into the mountains took the better part of 2 days, moving through snow that deepened progressively as they climbed away from the river valleys and into higher country. And the boys grew tired by the afternoon of the first day as the work of moving through the snow and the monotony of the white landscape wore on their small reserves, and they fell silent in a way that was new and almost eerie, no longer asking questions or commenting on what they saw. And Hannah made camp in a draw, sheltered by dense spruce trees that still held snow from the previous week in the upper branches, and she built a fire with deadfall wood that she gathered and split with her hands in the edge of a flat stone, and she heated water and gave each of the boys a cup of weak tea, boiled with a little sugar and precious milk powder, and bread with a small amount of the butter she had packed, and they ate and drank and fell asleep almost immediately. And she arranged them on a bedroll of blankets and canvas and lay down with them, and her body became a barrier against the worst of the cold, her warmth flowing into theirs. And she lay awake much of the night listening to the sound of the wind moving through the high branches above her and the occasional crack of ice in the trees. And she knew in that darkness that the season was turning toward something terrible and vast, that the snow falling now was merely the outrider of much worse storms to come, storms that would reshape the landscape and test the endurance of every living thing in this territory. And she felt something like certainty settle over her, a recognition that she had made a choice and would now live with the consequences of it. And she rose before the first light came and stamped out the fire carefully and woke the boys with soft words, and they continued climbing, and the sled was heavier now with the accumulated snow and the frozen supplies, but her pace was steady and even, her breathing regular, her mind fixed on the destination. And by midday they had reached the draw her husband had described in that map so many years ago, where the pines grew dense and close together, and the light was muted and blue, as though they had entered a different world entirely. And she found the outcropping of broken stone that marked the approach to the cave, the stone arranged in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, and then the entrance itself opened before her like the mouth of some great animal, a vast, dark opening in the mountainside that seemed to pull at her with a force she could not explain. And she stopped and held the rope with both hands and looked at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to make, the finality of stepping into that darkness with her children. And then she stepped forward, and the boys followed, and the snow fell soft around them. The interior of the ice cave was like nothing the boys had ever seen, and nothing Hannah had quite expected, despite her husband's patient and detailed descriptions offered on those nights when he had seemed to want her to understand the country in a comprehensive way. for the walls rose up in a great vault perhaps 60 feet high and maybe more, the ceiling lost in shadow and the upper reaches of the ice. And they were not white as she had imagined, but rather a translucent blue of extraordinary purity, a blue that seemed to come from within the ice itself, as though the ice held light rather than reflected it. And this blue-white luminescence illuminated the entire chamber with an otherworldly quality that made everything seem suspended outside of time, frozen into some eternal present, and the floor was smooth as water and sloped gently downward at first, and then descended more steeply into chambers beyond, chambers that descended into darkness that no light could penetrate. And there was indeed a warmth rising from somewhere deep in the stone, a tangible warmth that she could feel on her face and her hands, a warmth that should not exist in such a place. And she stood very still at the entrance, and let the boys down from the sled, and they moved forward with tentative steps, their feet slipping a little on the ice despite the care they took. And Callum reached out with his small hand and touched the wall and said, in a voice that sounded small and distant and filled with wonder, "It is like glass, Mama. It is like glass." And Hannah said, "It is ice older than we are, older than any of us will be, older than the mountains perhaps, and it is colder than anything in the world except itself." And they moved deeper into the cave with the blue light surrounding them, and she saw it then clearly. The volcanic basalt outcropping her husband had described in such detail that she had been able to see it in her mind during their long winters. A blackish stone formation rising from the cave floor like some ancient altar or shrine, rising up perhaps 6 feet at its apex, and it was warm to the touch when she extended her hand, genuinely and palpably warm, and the air around it shimmered faintly with heat that moved like smoke without being smoke, and where the warmth met the ice, there was a kind of melting occurring in a pattern that must have been constant and unchanging for ages, a slow, constant weeping of water that ran in tiny rivulets across the dark stone and froze again as it reached the colder ice further from the heat, creating patterns of white and clear ice like some slow-motion sculpture. Hannah released a long breath that she had not known she was holding and said, aloud but to herself, in a voice that the ice and stone carried away into their depths, "This will do. This will do. We have found what we came for." And she set about the work of bringing the sled into the cave, a labor that took the greater part of the afternoon and into the evening, for the entrance was narrow and the floor sloped downward, and the sled was heavy with the weight of the anvil and the tools, but she moved it in increments, hauling it forward and resting and then hauling again, and the boys, understanding now that they were establishing some permanent settlement, some refuge that would be theirs and no one else's, helped where they could push from behind, with their small palms pressed against the wood, and their faces grew flushed with effort and cold. And finally, the sled was positioned in the cave's main chamber on the warmest stone, and she unloaded it with deliberate care, placing the anvil on the very warmest part of the basalt outcropping where the heat rose strongest, and setting the bellows beside it, and laying out the tongs and hammers in a careful semicircle around the anvil as though creating some sacred geometry, and she arranged the coal and kindling in a natural depression in the stone and lit it with flint and steel, striking the flint with a patience born of long practice. And when the coal caught finally and began to glow with a deep red light, the smoke rose and curled upward toward the vaulted ceiling and disappeared into the cracks in the ice, where it rose and cooled and became part of the stone, and she fed the coal carefully with the bellows, working the handle back and forth with the rhythm of breath, until the fire was bright and steady and hot, radiating a heat that began to transform the immediate space around it. And then she took her largest hammer, the one her father had given her, and struck the anvil once. A single ringing blow that echoed through the chamber and came back from every direction at once, bouncing from the walls of ice and the vaulted ceiling and the stone floor, creating a sound that seemed to fill the entire world. And the boys covered their ears and laughed, a sound of pure joy and wonder that was their own and not shaped by anyone's mockery or judgment. And Hannah set the hammer down on the warm stone and felt something move in her chest that she had thought was gone forever. Some small coal of purpose that had somehow survived the death of her husband Angus, and the mockery of the town, and the cold judgments of the Reverend and his wife and all the others. And she fed more coal to the fire, and watched it burn bright and steady in the blue-white darkness of the cave. Watched the heat begin to transform the space into something other than ice, something other than cold, something that might become a home. That first night in the ice cave, Hannah arranged blankets and canvas carefully on the warm stone near the forge, creating a nest of sorts where the three of them might sleep, protected from the worst of the cold that still lived in the rest of the chamber. And she lay between her boys with the fire burning low but steady, neither growing nor dying. And the warmth from the basalt outcropping and the flames from the forge kept the worst of the cold at bay, though she could feel the chill waiting at the edges of their space like something patient and eternal. And Callum asked her in a small voice if they would stay here forever, and she said, "We will stay as long as we need to." And Ian asked if this was their home now, and she said, "Yes, this is our home now, and we will make it what we need it to be." And the boys seemed satisfied with these answers and fell asleep with their small, warm bodies pressed against her, their breathing becoming deep and regular within minutes. And Hannah lay awake, listening to the sound of the forge, fire, and the tick and crack of the ice around them as the temperature shifted between day and night. And she felt in that moment a kind of peace that she had not expected to find in such a place, a solitude that was not loneliness, but rather a kind of accord with the stone and ice and fire around her, an understanding that seemed to pass between her and the ancient rock, as though the cave had been waiting for her and her craft and her determination, as though her arrival here had been written into the stone ages ago. And she held her sons close and did not sleep, but rather remained awake through the long night, listening and watching, her hand resting on the warm stone beside the forge, feeling it pulse with the heat that came from the depths of the earth. In the following weeks and into the deepening winter, Hannah worked with deliberate and tireless purpose to transform the ice cave into a genuine shelter, a place where a woman and 2 children might actually live, not merely survive, but live with some measure of comfort and dignity. And she constructed crude timber screens from wood. She scavenged painstakingly from the deadfall timber that lay scattered near the cave entrance, wood that had to be gathered and carried down into the depths. And she lashed the wood together with strips of hide that she had tanned herself. And she hung hides and canvas across the gaps between the wooden frames to contain the heat from the forge and direct its flow toward their sleeping area, creating something like a room within the great chamber. And she created a separate and distinct chamber at the cave's side where she could store their supplies, the flour and salt and whatever meat she managed to acquire, and where the temperature would remain cold enough to keep the provisions from spoiling, a natural cold store that was far superior to anything she could have constructed with human hands. and she brought the water that ran constantly from the melting ice and directed it with careful placement of small stones along a course that led to a container she fashioned from bent metal, cutting and folding sheet metal with her tools and forge heating it to the precise temperatures needed for forming, so that they always had fresh, cold water. And she constructed a kind of roof of woven branches and hides above the warm stone to contain the smoke and direct it upward away from where they slept, and the boys helped with whatever tasks were suited to their small hands and growing strength, carrying bundles of branches from outside and patting clay that she had found in a depression beyond the cave entrance into the gaps between pieces of wood to create better seals against the cold air. And they grew darker skinned in the light from the forge, and their faces grew ruddier with the constant warmth that pulsed from the basalt stone, and their appetites grew robust and healthy as they worked and played in the great stone chamber, their voices echoing off the ice walls, and Hannah watched them and felt something like joy, though she would not have named it so. Her work at the forge resumed with an intensity that surprised even herself, an intensity born of necessity, but also of something more, a kind of redemption, a return to the purpose that had been severed when she was told she could no longer practice her craft in the town, and she brought out her husband's inventory of stock, raw iron rods of various thicknesses, metal rods for making nails, flat stock for hinges and brackets, metal scraps that he had collected over the years, and she began to forge with single-minded purpose, creating horseshoes and nails and chains, forging together broken iron pieces to make repairs to the tools that had come with them, salvaging what could be salvaged, and the ring of her hammer on the anvil became a constant and steady sound in the cave, a rhythm that carried and echoed through the chambers until it seemed the stone itself was humming with work and intention and the hum of creation. And the hiss of quenched iron was like steam rising from some ancient spring, a sound that spoke of transformation and change, and the smell of coal smoke and hot metal filled the entire chamber with a kind of signature that was unmistakably hers and hers alone, a smell that told any who might encounter it that a blacksmith was at work here, that this place had been claimed for the purpose of making and forging and creating, and the boys grew accustomed to this smell and came to love it. She created a set of iron ice hooks for herself from the finest of the stock her husband had left, fashioning the hooks themselves with exacting precision so they would bite into the ice, and the shafts with careful curves and angles so they would fit her hands exactly, feeling like natural extensions of her arms, and when she had completed them, she tested them on the ice walls of the cave and found that they would hold her weight without slipping, that they could support her as she moved across the vast spaces. And she practiced climbing the great vault of ice, with the boys watching from below, learning to move with confidence and grace in the vast space, understanding that if she was to truly survive here, truly make this place her own, she needed to master every aspect of it, to understand not just the forge and the craft, but the cave itself, the stone and the ice and the heat, and there was something in that mastery, in the knowledge that her own skill and her own hands could make the difference between survival and death, that spoke to something deep in her nature, something that had always been present, but that she had had to suppress in the town where women were meant to be soft and compliant. By the time that the winter had deepened to its middle point, when the snow outside the cave had become so deep and so persistent that the entrance was nearly buried beneath it, when the world beyond the cave had become almost entirely white and silent, Hannah made the difficult decision to return to Coldgate to trade her forged goods for flour and salt, and the few other supplies that she could not make or find in the mountains, supplies that would be necessary if the three of them were to survive the months ahead, and she wrapped careful bundles of horseshoes and nails in burlap, working late into the night to complete as many pieces as she could, and she loaded them onto a sled and took the boys with her, for she would not leave them alone in the cave, even for the few hours that the journey down the mountain and back would take. She could not bear the thought of them waking to find her gone, and they descended the mountain through snow that came up past the boys' knees, snow that fell constantly and seemed to replace itself as soon as it was disturbed, and they climbed down into the river valley, where Coldgate lay shrouded in white and smoke from the chimneys, and as they approached the town, Hannah pulled the hood of her cloak up over her head, the charcoal wool shadowing her face, and moved through the streets with steady purpose, her eyes fixed ahead, not looking left or right at the buildings or the people, moving like someone who knew exactly where she needed to go. The general store owner's wife stood behind the counter with her arms folded tight across her chest like armor, her face arranged into an expression of permanent disapproval, and when Hannah presented the horseshoes and nails for trade, carefully unwrapping them from the burlap to display the quality of the work, the woman looked at them with visible contempt, and then at Hannah with an expression of such visceral distaste that Hannah felt it like a physical blow to her chest, and the woman said, her voice loud enough to carry through the store, "We don't trade with savages who abandon Christian society." And then she spat in the snow at Hannah's feet, deliberately and with theatrical precision, and Hannah set the bundle down on the counter without a word, and turned and walked out of the store, and she took the boys to the church, where she knew Reverend Thorncroft kept an office, a small room off the sanctuary where he conducted his pastoral affairs, and she knocked and was admitted after a long pause. And the Reverend looked at her with eyes that held no trace of compassion or mercy, only a kind of cold satisfaction, and she showed him the horseshoes and nails and asked if the church would trade with her for flour and salt and tea, for surely the church had stores that could spare such basic necessities, and he said, his voice thin and reedy with righteousness, "Mrs. Veitch, you are making your boys into savages, raising them in a cave like animals without civilization or godliness, and you have put yourself beyond the pale of Christian society, and I cannot in good conscience trade goods from this parish to a woman who flouts the natural order and the word of God in such a public and shameful manner." And he gestured toward the door with a hand that trembled slightly with the force of his conviction, and she took the boys and left. And as they were departing the office, Cordelia Thorncroft appeared in the hallway as though she had been waiting for this moment, and she looked at Hannah and her sons with an expression of such undisguised hatred that the air seemed to chill further, and Hannah felt the weight of that hatred, and knew in that moment that she had made enemies who would not forgive her, who would not cease in their opposition to her until she was destroyed or gone entirely from this territory. But the town butcher Crick turned her away as well, saying he could not sell meat to a woman who was no longer respectable, and she stood in his shop with the horseshoes in her hands, and felt despair move at the edges of her mind, until she remembered Padraig Boyle, the old half-blind quartermaster at the stagecoach depot, an Irishman like herself who had been kind to Angus, and she found her way to the depot and showed him the horseshoes and nails, and his single good eye brightened with genuine interest, and he said, "Well now, these are honest goods and honestly made." And he gave her flour and salt and tea, and even a small piece of salt pork, and he would not hear of her leaving him short of the full value of her work, and he said to her, "Don't mind those sanctimonious bastards. They're afraid of you because you're stronger than they are." And Hannah felt some small warmth return to her chest at the recognition that there was at least one person in Coldgate who saw her clearly and did not despise her for her choice. The return journey to the ice cave was slower and more laborious than the descent had been, for the supplies that she had obtained were heavy with flour and salt, and the boys were tired from the walk through the town and the emotional weight of the rejections and the spitting, but Hannah drove them forward with steady and unwavering purpose, her hands gripping the sled rope, her shoulders bent to the work, and as the day wore on and they climbed back up into the foothills where the trees grew denser and the land began to remember its wildness, the light began to fade earlier than it should have, and the sky took on a peculiar quality that Hannah had learned to recognize, a kind of pale luminescence that came from somewhere low on the horizon to the north, a luminescence that was not the light of day but something else entirely. And the wind shifted direction and came from the north with a different character than it had had before, sharper and more sustained, and carrying with it a kind of coldness that was different from ordinary winter cold, a coldness that spoke of vast movement and tremendous power, and Hannah felt it in her bones and in her blood that something vast was moving toward them across the plains, some front of weather that would dwarf the snows they had already seen, that would make the previous weeks of snow seem like mere preliminaries. And she increased her pace despite her exhaustion and urged the boys to move faster, to walk with greater determination, and they climbed through gathering darkness toward the cave, climbing the last miles through increasing snow, and behind them the sky began to show the first white haze of what was coming, a haze that would become a blizzard, and then something worse still. A storm of such power and duration and fury that the winter that was already settling over the Wyoming Territory would be remembered for generations to come, would be spoken of in the terms of legend and loss. And the town of Coldgate, huddled in its valley with its churches and stores and warm buildings, with its mocking voices and its absolute certainties about the proper order of things, had no idea what was coming, had no comprehension of the forces that were gathering in the darkness above the mountains, of the storm that would remake the landscape and test the endurance of every living thing in this territory. And Hannah, pulling her sled through the snow with her sons beside her, moving step by step toward the cave, toward the ice cave waiting above them like a refuge carved from the heart of stone and ice itself, understood with absolute clarity that everything was about to change, that the real test of her choice was not what lay behind her in the mockery of the town, but what was waiting in the darkness ahead, that this winter would show whether her decision had been wisdom or folly, and she climbed on, pulling her sons and her supplies toward the blue-white walls of the cave that waited like a sanctuary in the darkness. The storm came in the night like a living thing, like a great gray animal with nothing behind its eyes but hunger and will, and it brought with it a wind that seemed to have traveled across all the frozen wastes of the North Country before arriving at Thunder Ridge with the voice of something ancient and without pity, a sound like wolves crying in some distant canyon, and like the splitting of wood under the bite of ice, and like the earth itself breaking apart along fault lines that had been waiting since the world was young. And Hannah woke in the darkness of the ice cave to that sound, a sound that penetrated the blue walls themselves and resonated through them like the walls had become the instrument through which the storm made its terrible music. and she rose from her blanket where the boys lay sleeping, their small bodies curled against the warmth that radiated from the basalt outcropping at the heart of the cave, and went to the mouth of the cave, where the wind struck her face with such force that it stole her breath and brought tears that froze on her cheeks before she could blink them away. The snow was coming down in sheets so thick and so relentless that she could not see 3 feet into the white wall before her, and behind her, in the blue depths of the cave, the forge burned red and steady, a small sun burning at the heart of winter, a heartbeat of heat in the middle of the vast cold. And she knew then, without doubt, that the great die-up had come. The storm that miners and ranchers and old men who had seen the frontier long spoke of with a kind of dread reverence. A storm that killed without meaning and without mercy, that took what it wished and left only the cold bones of those who could not endure. And she stood at the threshold between the screaming cold and the warmth at her back and felt the weight of decision settle on her shoulders like the weight of the whole valley settling there, waiting to see what she would do, waiting to see if she would seal herself and her sons away or if she would do something else entirely. She turned from the mouth of the cave and began to work, moving with the kind of grim certainty that comes from having already decided what must be done, gathering canvas and boards and stones, sealing the entrance against the wind and the driving snow, leaving only a small opening near the ceiling for the chimney of the forge to exhale its smoke and heat into the white fury outside. And as she worked, she became aware of the sound that the wind made when it encountered the stone and ice, a high whistling sound that seemed to carry meaning in its tones, seemed almost like language. And she wondered if the mountain itself was speaking to her, telling her what would come, and she did not flinch from whatever message was being sent, but only redoubled her efforts to make the cave a womb, a place where life could be sheltered and preserved against the dying cold. The boys were awake when she came back to the fire, Callum and Iane sitting cross-legged with their thin blankets pulled around them like cloaks, their eyes wide and dark in the flickering light that came from the forge, reflecting the red glow in their pupils, and she knelt between them and told them in a voice that carried no doubt, no suggestion of fear, that they were safe now, that the cave was a womb and would hold them as a mother holds her children, that the warmth around them would endure as long as she had coal and as long as her heart beat, that she would not let the cold take them no matter what voice it used to call or what shape it wore in the darkness. She smoothed their hair and saw in their faces the face of her husband, the high cheekbones and the determined set of the mouth, and she thought of him working in the smithy in town, working before she had arrived in his life, working after she had left it through his death, always working, always making things that had weight and consequence and would outlast him. And she thought that this was what it meant to be a human being in the wilderness. It meant you worked so that the thing you loved would not die. And she sent the boys back to sleep against the leather bags she had filled with coal dust weeks ago, bags that still held the smell of her husband's hands upon them, a smell like iron and like sweat and like the inside of the earth. And she returned to the forge with a kind of grim purpose, knowing that the blizzard outside was the catalyst that would determine whether she lived by the grace of chance or by the strength of what she could make with her own 2 hands, whether survival would be something that happened to her or something that she would craft, stroke by stroke, blow by blow, at the anvil. For 9 days the storm did not break. Not once, not even to catch its breath. 9 days of wind that howled through the small chimney, opening and down into the great vaulted chamber of ice. 9 days in which the snow piled against the canvas seal of the cave mouth and the world beyond became something theoretical, something that might have been dreamed, something that could never have existed at all. And in those 9 days and nights, Hannah worked as she had never worked before, working in shifts when one body was too tired to raise the hammer, when her shoulders burned with a fire that had nothing to do with the forge, when her hands grew blistered and the blisters broke and bled into the handle of the hammer, working despite all of this, feeding the coal to the fire, pumping the bellows, heating the iron until it glowed like a living thing, and then striking it, shaping it, quenching it, the hiss rising up like the sound of the world being made. And she would sleep 3 and 4 hours at a time, not in any deliberate way, but simply collapsing when her body would no longer obey her will, sleeping in the warmth near the forge while the boys slept nearby, and then waking to feed the forge and to warm milk for her sons, on a plate of iron heated in the coals, pressing the plate to her breast to keep it warm as she carried it to them, and to continue the work that had become the whole substance of her life in this moment. She made what she could imagine the valley needing, and she made it with a kind of meditation, a state where thought and action became the same thing, where the hammer in her hand became an extension of her will, and her will became the thing that shaped the iron. Stove parts she had memorized from watching her husband work. Door hinges in sets of 6 that would last decades beyond her death. Spike nails in bundles that would fasten wood to wood and create permanence where there had been only fragments. Cooking irons that could sit on a hearth and hold a pot, heating water, feeding people. And then, in the deep quiet of the 5th night of the storm, after Callum and Iane had fallen into the deep sleep of children, after Padraig was not yet even a shadow on the horizon of her consciousness, after she had stoked the forge one more time and the red light was climbing the ice walls like flames climbing to heaven, she began to forge something she had not made before, something that came to her not as a plan, conceived in the ordinary way, but as a kind of vision, a small iron stove, compact and elegant in its proportions, a box with a door hinged with her own hands, a chimney that could rise into any hearth, designed in the darkness and solitude of her mind to burn coal efficiently and to throw heat into a room like a beating heart throws blood into a body, to warm the cold as a mother warms a child. And she worked through the night and into the next day, hammering the pieces on her anvil, heating each one to the precise color of red that meant it was ready to be shaped, plunging it into the fire, drawing it back to the anvil, striking it again and again and again, the ring of the hammer amplified by the ice walls, until it seemed that the whole mountain was singing, that the very stone and ice of Thunder Ridge was joining her in this work, the sparks rising up toward the blue vault of the ceiling with each strike, clouds of sparks climbing like stars ascending toward heaven, like the spirits of all the things she had made in her lifetime, rising up into some final brightness. She worked with a state of mind that was beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, a state where her body had become merely an instrument through which something else was acting, some necessity that was not her own, but that had chosen her as its vessel. And when she quenched the final piece in the bucket of water kept near the forge, water that had been warmed by the heat of the forge and that steamed in the cold air, when she plunged the glowing metal into that water, the hiss that rose up was like the sound of creation, the sound of chaos being ordered by will and fire in the hands of a woman who refused to let her valley die. By the 9th day of the blizzard, in the cold hours before dawn when the fire burns lowest and the night seems like it might last forever, she had forged 5 small stoves in the design she had perfected through countless hours of imagining and building, along with enough supplementary parts to complete a sixth, along with doors and hinges and grates that could be fitted to any hearth, and she stacked them carefully near the entrance of the cave where the cold could not crack them, draped them with canvas to protect them, and looked at them in the dim light that came from the forge, a light that seemed to make the iron glow with its own inner heat. And she understood in that moment that she had made something that might matter, something that might preserve the lives of people who had mocked her, who had called her unwomanly and sinful, and unfit to hold her husband's trade. And the understanding came to her not as a comfort, but as a weight, as something that bound her to a course of action, as something that meant she could no longer remain in the cave as a woman who had merely survived, but would have to become a woman who had acted. And she sat down on the cold stone floor and wept a little, not from sorrow, but from the weight of knowing what she would have to do, from the weight of the choice that lay before her like a chasm. And the tears that came from her eyes froze on her cheeks and fell as tiny crystals to the stone beneath her, fallen like the snow was falling outside, like the world was dissolving into its component parts. In the town of Coldgate, which was only 2 miles across the White Valley, but which might as well have been on another continent, for all the possibility of reaching it through the blizzard, people were dying in increments, the way that the cold kills everything that is not equipped for it, slowly at first and then with a kind of Russian inevitability. And Reverend Eustace Thorncroft was lying on a settee before a fireplace that had gone black and cold, the wood having run out days before, his body beginning to cease its operations, his breath coming in smaller gasps, his wife Cordelia sitting in a chair near him like a woman carved from ice herself, her fingers curled blue because the blood had retreated from the extremities as the body chose which parts were necessary for survival and which could be sacrificed. And she was thinking in the way that people think in extremity, thinking small and brittle thoughts about nothing at all because large thoughts were too terrible to bear. And she was remembering the taste of warm bread and could not recall ever tasting anything else, could not recall a world where bread was not the taste of her entire existence. The general store owner's wife had closed the shutters against the wind and was burning furniture, splintering chairs against the hearth, breaking them into pieces and feeding them to a fire that barely burned, watching the wood char and crack and turn to ash. And already 3 children had been found in the morning stiff in their beds because they had cried for warmth and there was no warmth to give them. And their mothers had held them and waited for them to warm again, and they had not warmed. And the butcher's ice house stood full of meat that could not be reached because the door was frozen solid and the men of the town were too weak to break it. And in the schoolhouse, 12 of the school-age children had clustered together under every blanket the town could find, pressed against each other for warmth, their teacher reading to them in the dark, the only light coming from a single lamp that had been rationed to burn 1 hour in every 4. The teacher reading stories about warm places in summer and fields full of flowers, knowing that the stories were all that stood between the children and despair. It was on the 10th day of the blizzard, in the hours near dawn when the cold becomes absolute and the darkness seems like it might never end, when old Padraig Boyle came to the mouth of the ice cave, appearing through the white like something risen from the dead, like a ghost made of snow and frost, half blind as he had always been from the cataracts that clouded his eyes, and now blinder still from the snow that had sealed his eyes shut, his lungs heaving, his breath coming in gasps that seemed to tear at his throat, his lips black with frostbite, his hands stiff inside their gloves, the fingers beginning to lose sensation. He had walked 2 miles from the stage depot where he had been stranded with a supply shipment that had arrived the day before the storm began, and he had understood, the way a man who has lived long in rough country understands without needing to think about it, that the town was going to die unless someone brought them what they had not brought for themselves, that the comfortable assumptions that sustained them would turn to nothing in the cold. And he had lashed together a small bundle of goods, salted fish, hardtack, a bundle of cloth, and set out at first light, if what counted for light in the blizzard could be called light. And now he stood at the edge of the ice cave with his strength nearly gone, barely enough left to stand. And he saw the seal across the opening and heard the sound of the forge burning inside, a sound like the heartbeat of the earth. And he raised his hand to call out, but no sound came, only a croak like the cry of a raven. Hannah found him there when she came to check the canvas seal for the 10th time that day, to ensure that the wind had not torn it away. And she saw at once what had been required of him to make this walk, saw it in the way he could barely stand, in the frost on his beard that had accumulated until it seemed like his face was carved from ice, in the way his eyes moved uselessly in their sockets, searching for something they could no longer see. And she brought him inside without speaking, brought him close to the forge and wrapped him in one of the blankets she had been rationing, wrapped him like he was one of her sons, and gave him water warmed on the iron, water that had grown warm from the heat of the forge, and listened while he told her, his voice hoarse and breaking like ice, breaking on a river in spring, about the town dying, about the children lost, about how the Reverend himself had collapsed, and Cordelia was sitting like a woman carved from ice, about the whole of Coldgate shutting down like a body going rigid in death, the systems that kept it alive beginning to fail one by one, until there was nothing left but cold, and the question of how much longer the human heart could beat in such conditions. She listened and said nothing, and in the silence of her listening was the complete annihilation of any satisfaction she might have felt at being proven right, at being told she was foolish and unwomanly, and now watching the very people who had said those things begin to understand what she had known all along, which was that the frontier was not a place where feelings mattered, where propriety or tradition or the way women were supposed to be mattered in the slightest. It was a place where only the ability to make fire and shelter and to endure mattered, and those capacities had nothing to do with gender or propriety, and everything to do with will and knowledge and the willingness to work beyond the point where most people would have stopped. And she understood that she could not remain in the cave and simply survive while the town died, that her survival would taste of ashes if she did, that the person she had become in the work at the forge, the person who had made things that were useful and good, could not go back to being the person who accepted mockery and exclusion and did nothing in return. When Patrick had slept, when the boys had been fed and sent back to their blankets, when the forge had been stoked for the long night and the coal had been arranged so that the fire would burn steady and true through the darkness, Hannah began to load the stove she had made onto a sled she constructed from wood, salvaged from the cave floor, from timbers that had drifted there in some ancient time, and that she had gathered and carefully preserved, lashing each stove with leather cord, packing coal carefully into burlap sacks that she had sewn herself, folding her iron cooking plates and wrapping them in canvas, and then she lifted the sled with the leather harness that had been fashioned for just such hauling, feeling the weight of it settle into her shoulders, and took from the pouch at her side the compass her dead husband had carried through all his working years, the compass he had carried when he was a younger man, and had come west before coming to the place where he had met her, and laid her hand on the heads of her sleeping sons and told them, though they slept and could not hear her in any ordinary way, that she would return, that she was going to do what must be done, that they should not fear the dark or the cold or the sound of the wind, because she would come back to them. And she wondered as she said these things whether she was making a promise she could keep, whether the blizzard would take her as it was taking so many others. But she did not let the doubt change her intention. The walk from the ice cave to Coldgate through the storm was perhaps the longest walk of her life, though it was only 2 miles, and though she had walked farther in pursuit of supplies and in pursuit of knowledge and in pursuit of the simple facts of survival. But this walk was different because it was a choice made in full knowledge of what it would cost her, not a walk required by necessity, but a walk elected by conscience. And she pulled the sled through drifts that came up to her waist, the leather harness cutting into her shoulders, even through the thick wool of her cloak, her breath coming in clouds that froze on the fabric of her collar, the wind coming at her from all directions at once, sometimes from the front and sometimes from the side, trying to push her off course. And somewhere in the white confusion ahead was the town that had cast her out, that had called her names, and she moved toward it, like someone moving toward the only thing that mattered, which was the living of a human life in a way that did not betray the dead, in a way that would have made her husband proud if he had lived to see it. She came to Coldgate by night on the 11th day of the blizzard, stumbling through the white toward the shapes of buildings that loomed like things in a fever dream, like structures that existed in some world other than the one she inhabited. And the first structure she reached was the general store, and she broke down the door with the heel of her boot because there was no time for gentleness, and because she understood at that moment that the rules of propriety had burned away in the forge with all the coal she had fed to its heart. And inside the store she found the owner's wife half conscious, surrounded by the splinters of furniture she had burned, the wood ashes gray and cold across the floor, and she left her there, but left also a bundle of the cloth that Padraig had carried, telling her mutely through the gesture that more would come. And then she pulled the sled to the parsonage, to the house of the Reverend Eustace Thorncroft, who had preached against her from the pulpit, who had called her work sinful and unwomanly from the mouth of the church. And she broke down that door as well, because the righteous do not hesitate, and neither did she. And she found the Reverend and his wife in the dark, like figures carved from the cold itself, barely breathing, barely alive. And without a word, she brought the first of the small stoves inside and set it in the hearth and assembled it with hands that moved like they were guided by something other than her own will. Something that had taken over her body and was making her do what needed to be done. And she laid a fire in the stove with coal from her sacks, and struck a spark, and watched the coal catch, and watched the heat begin to rise into the room like a resurrection, like something dead coming back to life. And she placed an iron plate that she had heated in the stove against Cordelia's breast, wrapped it in cloth so it would not burn her skin, and watched as the woman's breathing began to deepen. And she gave a cup of water warmed on the stove to the Reverend, and watched him open his eyes, truly open them for the first time in days, and return to the world of the living. Over the next 3 days, as the blizzard began at last to break into gusts, and then into wind, and then into a kind of exhausted falling snow, she walked from house to house, through the dark and the falling snow, carrying the stoves and the coal and the iron plates, setting them in place, lighting them, staying long enough to ensure the fire would catch and hold, watching the families gather around the new heat like they had been given back their lives. And she supplied them with coal from the cache her husband had accumulated, coal that had been sitting in the ice cave through all these years, coal that seemed to have been waiting for just this moment. And over the next 3 days, she made 6 trips from the ice cave to Coldgate, each time pulling the sled loaded with coal and returning with empty sacks, each time moving through the snow, each time staying longer in the town, until by the time the snow finally ceased on the 14th day of the storm, until the clouds broke apart and the sun returned to the sky and the wind died away like some wild animal exhausted from its own fury. She had distributed 5 of her small iron stoves to the most vulnerable families in the town, clustering them in the church where the children had sheltered, in the parsonage where the Reverend and Cordelia lay recovering, in the homes of the elderly and infirm. And the town was still alive, still breathing, still full of beating hearts, because she had chosen to make it so. When the Reverend could finally stand without leaning heavily on the furniture, when his strength had returned enough that he could walk to the window and look out at the world being revealed as the snow fell away, he came to find her working the bellows outside his parsonage in the new morning light, her dark hair coming loose from its braid, her face smeared with coal dust, and he asked her to forgive him, asked her to forgive the town, spoke about charity and about the sin of pride, and about the ways that the frontier revealed the truth of human hearts, about how they had been wrong to mock her, how they had been wrong to close the smithy to her. But she did not respond to his words in any way except with a nod, a small inclination of her head that might have meant acceptance or might have meant only acknowledgement that he had spoken, and she did not accept the offer of the town to rebuild the smithy in Coldgate, to give her a place of honor, to make her into some kind of heroine whose story they could tell at dinner parties. But instead, she said, her voice quiet and steady and without anger or pride, that the ice cave was her forge now, that it would always be her forge, and that those who wished to trade for her work would have to come to her, would have to make the journey across the valley, would have to understand that her work was not something that could be brought into their towns and made respectable, and she would make what they needed at prices that were fair, and she would not submit to the false civilizations that the towns tried to impose on themselves, the hierarchies and the proprieties and the rules about who could do what, based on nothing but the accident of gender. She returned to the ice cave to find Padraig sitting near the forge with Callum and Iane beside him, the old man's sightless eyes turned toward the heat of the fire, and the boys were taking turns working the bellows, their small hands working the handles up and down, and the old man was telling them about the work of forging, about the way iron must be heated until it glows like the heart of the sun, about the way the hammer shapes the metal, about the way a person's will can be transmitted through a tool into matter and change the nature of that matter forever. And she understood that her sons had been learning the craft while she was away saving the town, that Padraig had given them this gift while she was out walking through the snow, and she understood that this was the way it should be, that the knowledge would pass from her hands to theirs, that the work would continue beyond her death, that the cave would ring with the hammer and the song of iron long after she was gone. The spring came slowly, the way spring comes in the high country, in fits and starts and with no certainty, the snow melting during the warm days and freezing again at night, the ice beginning to drip from the mouth of the cave, creating icicles that hung like the teeth of some great beast, and eventually the snow melted away entirely, and the ice began to recede, and the valley roads became passable, and people began to make the walk from Coldgate to the ice cave where the great forge burned, and the blue walls rose up, like the vault of some cathedral, to the God of making and survival. And they came not out of gratitude alone, but out of a genuine hunger for the things that Hannah made, for the stoves and the hinges, and the carefully forged implements that would last longer than the people who used them. They came to trade for the small iron stoves, for hinges and nails, for the cooking irons that Hannah had designed, for hooks that could hold a lamp or a pot or the weight of a human life, and they paid fairly now, without the grudging sense of transaction that had colored their earlier dealings. And they came with a kind of reverence, because they understood that their lives had been held in the balance during those terrible days, and that it was this woman, with the storm-gray eyes and the chestnut braid, now streaked with the first silver of age, and the blacksmith's apron stained with the blood and sweat of years, who had held them there, not through magic or luck, but through the simple force of will and craft and the willingness to work beyond the point where most people would have stopped. Over the years that followed, the fame of the ice cave smith spread through the Wyoming Territory and beyond, passed along in the stories that travelers told around campfires, in the accounts of freight drivers and ranch hands, and the occasional newspaper man who made the journey to the cave to see it for himself and to interview the woman who had done the impossible. And eventually, a traveling photographer came with his equipment, a great wooden camera and glass plates and chemicals that he mixed in the cold air, and he took a daguerreotype of Hannah at the anvil, the ice walls rising behind her like the walls of some crystalline cathedral, the light of the forge catching in her eyes, making them glow with an inner fire, and the image was circulated in Eastern newspapers under the caption, "The Ice Cave Forge of Wyoming, a woman's testament to frontier industry and courage," and in drawing rooms in Boston and Philadelphia and New York, in places where the frontier was only a place that existed in stories and in the imagination. People looked at this image and were struck by something in the face of the woman who stared back at them, something that could not be explained by the simple fact of her profession, but which spoke instead to the way that the frontier had begun to reveal the insufficiency of all the old rules about what women could do and could be. And many of them wept without quite understanding why they wept. But Hannah did not read the newspapers and did not care about the daguerreotype, and she continued in the work that had become the whole substance of her life, and her sons Callum and Ian grew up with the hammer in their hands, the weight of it becoming so familiar that they could not imagine their hands without it, and by the time they were 15, they could work the forge as well as she could, and they could design new implements and improve on her designs. And they began to forge pieces that were sold throughout the territory, stoves and hinges, an artistic piece that people kept in their homes, not because they needed them, but because they wanted to own something made by the ice cave smiths. And the cave became a place of pilgrimage for those who believed that human beings could make beautiful things in the darkest places, that out of ice and coal and the heat of a forge could come things of lasting worth. And in the years when she was older, when her hair had gone silver and her hands had grown gnarled from the work but no less skilled, when her hammer had become something like an extension of her own body, when the work had worn grooves into her palms and her forearms had grown thick with the muscle of years of lifting and striking, Hannah would stand at the anvil in the blue light of the ice walls and work, and the ring of the hammer would echo through the mountain like a bell, calling something back from the dead, like the voice of the earth itself speaking. And if anyone had asked her whether she regretted the choice she had made, the choice to defy the town and the reverend and all the voices that had said she was unwomanly and sinful, that had tried to confine her to the narrow space they had made for women on the frontier, she would not have answered with words, but would only have lifted the hammer and brought it down on the glowing iron, and the sparks would have climbed into the blue crystal vault above her like stars ascending into heaven, like all the things that had been said against her burning away into pure light, and the sound of the hammer would have been the only answer needed, ringing through the cave and out into the valley beyond, telling anyone who could hear that here was a woman who had taken her suffering and her rejection and her loss and had made them into iron, and the iron had warmed a valley, and the valley had been saved not by the grace of God or the mercy of good intentions, but by the work of her two hands and the fire that she had learned to love.